In an increasingly polarized world, it seems that one point of commonality among left and right and center is that our way of doing political decision-making is fundamentally quite cooked. There seems to be an increasing level of polarization, an increasing level of inaccessibility, an increasing level of general bafflement in the way in which we've entrusted a small group of elected officials to have inordinate say over our lives, both on matters of high policy on which expertise may be required, but also on matters of uncounted and innumerable moral issues upon which we should all feel accustomed and able to have our say. Many publics fundamentally accomplish the goal of restoring the ordinary person back to the space of contested moral politics, and does so in a way that results in decisions that are structurally better for the people affected, fundamentally more inclusive in a fundamentally tolerant society, and are seen as more legitimate by all people who have to live under the laws thus passed. I'm going to do a little bit of setup, then I will talk about better decision-making, more legitimate decision-making, and if I have a bit of time, I'll talk about accountability too, because I understand that is a real issue as well. In terms of setup, a couple of points to make here. The first thing I want to say about these mini-publics is that they are not going to be a single body of 7 or 8 people who then have an veto-less say on the way in which all laws are drafted. We think relatively similar to the system that was adopted of citizens' assemblies in Ireland or in Chile during the constituent process. It will be a large number of individual bodies in various communities around the country selected at random, but with a basis for representing the population at large, whose decisions and deliberations with the assistance of taking expert advice, testimony, and evidence are then aggregated across the whole country to produce what looks like a consensus among many small individuated mini-publics, which is then translated with the assistance of experts into legally binding text that then takes the force of law. So relatively straightforward setup, and if it sounds familiar, it's because it is the process by which citizens' assemblies... Oh, clarification on this?
Yeah, so is there going to be a different mini-public for each policy? Is this going to be static?
It probably will be policy by policy, and we'll leave it up to specific acts of elected legislatures when a mini-public is called upon for a particular social issue.
Clarification.
Yes?
So can you clarify how large are these mini-publics? How many people are coming in? And how are you sampling?
So again, probably akin to the Irish example, it will probably be a large number across the country of individual mini-publics, and each individual deliberative group will probably look relatively small, kind of like a jury, about a dozen people or so. Okay. So why does it result in decisions that are being better made? A couple of reasons why decision-making is fundamentally better when done by a mini-public process as compared to the standard, just elected legislature. First of all, the principled basis. As the info slide suggests, these are social issues which engage in questions of high morality, for which there is no fixed, objective, correct answer, and for which no particular technical expertise is warranted. These are things like, how should we approach the vexed issue of assisted dying for people who face terrible health situations or towards the end of their life? How should we include people who are historically on the margins of social conduct? What kinds of bodily substances you can, there's a weird way to phrase it, it's like whether drugs should be legal, for example, things that don't particularly have a particularly objective answer. On that basis, there is no correct objective answer. It is fundamentally principally correct that those who are most affected by that decision should have a more direct and proximate say, and that is more likely to be the people who are particularly affected and the people who live under those laws. The old adage that's like, I think, a few thousand years old at this point is that the shoemaker has the technical expertise to make the shoe, but only the wearer can say where it pinches. We tell you the ordinary people, those who feel the pinch, and for that reason they should be principally elevated as close as they can into the decision-making process. Also, by its very nature, a mini-public is more representative of society at large. We think that elected legislatures are making steps towards being more reflective and representative of the population at large, but that is still slow and halting progress. Gender equality is still the exception rather than the rule. Racial equality in terms of making up the population at large is still very sparing. But in particular, the ways in which economic and class is represented in elected legislatures is actually getting worse in recent years as a professional managerial class of people disproportionately from law schools with multiple degrees makes up most of those decision-making processes. We take a more representative sampling of society, particularly on the matter of what we told you are fundamentally social policies, and so on, that is more representative and results in better reflected there. Also, just the decision-making process is more focused. What I mean by this is when you have a mini-public that is called upon to answer one specific question: should marijuana be legal? Should assisted dying be legal? How should we handle same-sex marriage, same-sex adoption? That is the one matter on which they are empowered. That is the one matter on which they hear testimony, on which they take advice, and they then render a thoughtful decision over a long process. By comparison, legislators, and particularly senior legislators, are some of the most time-poor people on earth who have to balance very difficult philosophical and social questions against day-to-day constituency work, against every other regulatory issue that is before them, against things like party politics and intra-party politics. We tell you that the disproportionate level of focus that a mini-public gives also results in a more deliberative and better made decision. I'll take that POI for proposal.
You say that legislatures are time poor. It is their job to legislate. Do these people still have jobs which they've got to do, and will they be brought in these groups against their will to deliberate on these issues which think they care about?
So we think the main point here is that social issues are ones which often generally benefit from a longer deliberative process because the answers there are not found in the realms of technical and expert advice. We tell you that the modern elected legislator is particularly good at synthesizing advice from civil servants, departmental reports, legal reports, and translating that into technical regulatory policy and macroeconomic prudential stuff like that. We think they're very good at that. They're less good at reflecting the social mores of the people they report to represent on social issues. Yes?
So how are you going to compel people like with jury selection, or is this like selecting for volunteers?
It will be compelled like jury service in order to be represented in the population. There'll be sort of compensation for the time spent. We think that's relatively within enough yet. Okay, lastly, decisions are likely to be more inclusive for a number of reasons. Politicians are quite risk-averse in the status quo and generally don't want to touch issues that are particularly contested or particularly contestable, and that is most social policy, right? We think for that reason, issues like same-sex marriage and the rights of LGBT individuals, things like assisted dying, have been very difficult to get on the political agenda and generally have come from civil society pressuring politicians to do so. It is much easier for politicians to farm these decisions out and actually get these issues debated and resolved in a better decision at a point at which they're able to take the pressure off themselves towards a citizens' assembly or mini-public to make those decisions. We also think the decisions themselves are fundamentally more likely to be inclusive because politicians have a particular risk-averse bias towards balancing competing constituency groups and structurally fundamentally underestimate the inclusive attitudes of the people they represent. So to use one particularly indicative example, politicians in the UK are regularly asked to deal with matters of transgender inclusion, for example, and fundamentally to structurally underestimate the extent to which the British public itself holds more inclusive views. We think for those reasons you'll actually get more inclusive decision-making, particularly once people who are on many publics taking the advice that is given to them. Lastly, why the decision is more legitimate? Because right now, there's a particular incentive towards the cultural war polarization of social issues that is primarily based around a narrative that social change is something that is imposed top-down by elected officials who are out of touch with ordinary social views. It is impossible to make that argument at the point at which social change becomes a vehicle that is engineered by people who are fundamentally representative of ordinary people rather than a political class. The decisions that emerge from many publics seem more legitimate by the people who are then affected by them and the people who have to live under the laws that are thus passed. For those reasons, the decisions are more enduring and you should side with the jury.
Alright, I think Pia, Ella.
Cool. Three, two, one. I want to just talk about how insane the setup that comes out from OG is, because I want to just take a second and think about what this is. It's large country. We're going to pick lots of people, put them in lots of jury selections, and get them to make big decisions, and hopefully it comes out timely. The problem with this is even if this is jury selection, even if you can opt out, there are two problems with just their setup. The first is if you opt out, clearly this isn't very well representative. People who are poor that can't afford to leave their jobs for long periods of time just don't opt in, they leave, so you don't get massive amounts of good democracy anyways. You probably get massive amounts of rich people that are the only ones that can engage with the system meaningfully. But the second one is it is preposterous to imagine that these issues can be done in a very long-term fashion and that's totally acceptable, especially given the fact that, yes, maybe these are single issue value problems that you have, but if they are, one, I don't know what you mean mini-publics. Just hold a fucking huge consensus. If people are like, no, we don't want death penalty, remove the death penalty, for instance. That's the first problem. But the second thing is, clearly there's a large degree of time that this takes, and such a large degree of time that it seems astronomically large on the comparative to what we get now. What I'm going to do in this speech is I'm going to do two things. I want to talk about mini-publics broadly, and I'm going to categorize them under two dimensions, specifically structural problems that exist with them, and then dynamical problems. And the second thing that I want to talk about is just bureaucrats, and why bureaucrats being the alternative, which is what we have now, are probably a better positioned actor to just implement social policy for a wide variety of reasons. let's talk about mini-publics. And the first thing that I want to explain is the structural issues. I think there's 4 of them. The first is administrative and operational. So the thing is, the structures for translating the recommendations of mini-publics into actionable policy proposals are often really inadequate. Because here's the thing. Maybe social policies seem simple when they're on value bases, but when you want to implement them, they often require a large degree of technical prowess in the way that you push this out. Whether this looks like knowing how tax codes work so you can adequate them and do it, I'm sure you can imagine other reasons why you need technical implementation in good ways. What this means is it's not clear that mini-public decision translates to the, even in a philosophical sense, the way that they want it to be translated from, because they don't engage with the technical application of this policy. But the second thing that this explains is that I think it clashes really well given OG's setup and explaining why it's the case that oftentimes these things are going to take a long fucking time to do because you need to now have consensus from many different groups. The second issue is following up the first one, which is just a big lack of specialized knowledge. And what this means is that I think that the random process here, the idea that OG has, is this is good for democratic representation where people feel removed from policy making. But again, you don't have expertise necessary to explain this. And the structural deficiency means that a lot of members, particularly ones in a lot of different groups, are probably unable to find consensus internally within themselves, right? And I think this is important, because what it means is that social policies need to be technical to some degree to be effective, to have good implementation writ large in a lot of instances. The third problem here is that we think there becomes a big challenge in achieving good representation, right? Because despite trying to mirror the demographic makeup of a large group and a large population, structural limitations in the selection process that we pointed out at the very top probably lead to huge imbalances. The other things here are like self-selection bias and differential participation ability, which skew the proposition of mini-publics. They undermine their ability to be good and legitimate and representative, and we think people opt out. The fourth thing is just like their setup. This is fucking expensive as shit. Think about it. It costs a lot of fucking money to now create lots of different fucking juries that vote on social issues that you previously don't have, that I think the vast majority of governments can't afford. So what it means is either you trade off some degree of technical implementation, because you don't have the money to do it in the best sort of way, or you just trade off something else that's probably necessarily works. And the things that you are likely to trade off are other big administrative thrusts that you carry out in the status quo. So the short-term bureaucratic positions that largely only focus on technical applications in our status quo are the ones that probably are cut because they're just in line with the sorts of things that you do about. CG.
Yeah, so a deliberative mini-public would make a broad decision. It would say we should legalize euthanasia, and here are some broad criteria for how we should implement it. And then obviously bureaucrats on either side of the house decide on exact tax implementation. That's a very straight model pick.
Look, no, the problem that I'm trying to say here is sure, maybe they have criteria, maybe bureaucrats do it, but given that they're not specifically implementing the policy, given that they're not showing very clear ways of doing it, it's very clear that it's easy for bureaucrats to either sidestep the burdens or create new harms that are really hard to do just so they can maintain the current proposition or the current status quo. Here's the other issue, and now it's on dynamic issues. We think there's similarly 3 of them. The first is that we think that these mini-publics are substantially more susceptible to bias and manipulation comparatively to bureaucrats. Because the thing is, the dynamics in group deliberation in these things make you particularly vulnerable to interest groups, to biased information, or to persuasive individuals. And this comes from the fact they have different varying ability of members to be able to critically assess arguments and resist manipulation. But given the setup, I think there's an even worse harm here, where it is that we think that places that are demographically poorer are substantially more susceptible to large amounts of lobbying efforts in a way that doesn't exist right now. So here's the thing, you're a big lobbying group, not to pass X policy that you want to get through for whatever which reason. Your easy pathway of doing this is you go to the area that's been historically poor and you offer them large amounts of money to do this. Sure, there are protections against this within the status quo with politicians, but it's a lot harder to do this when you have way more people to necessarily keep accountable. So it means that it becomes really easy to lobby people in a way that you previously can't under our current system, in a way that's likely to be bad. The second thing is here is we just think that it creates for bad deliberation. And I think effective deliberation needs skills and conditions that you as chairs and panels understand. You need to make things short as 15 minutes. We think when you have this many people, we think it prolongs them indefinitely sometimes. We make them very, very long in a way that isn't necessarily good. The third problem is that we think there's a short-term focus in dealing, right? Because people have things they need to get to. They want to get back to their lives, so they're less likely to be long-term like OG wants in the ways that are good, so you can reach the most adequate sort of consensus that's likely positive. And the fourth thing is that we think that the motivation of people to actively engage varies widely, right? It affects the quality of deliberation writ large, and we think this means that it's not really clear you get good dynamics because of this. It means that you are more likely than not going to have really fucking long deliberations that are difficult to concede on and that make it very hard to achieve scaled consensus on the things that you want. Maybe the comparative is worse and less representative ideas. I don't think that's true, and I'll explain why in a second. But we think that it's a faster comparative that gets at least some level of change through the grid works of social policies writ large. So then, why are bureaucrats necessarily better? We think, in brief, one, they generally have more specialized expertise. There's two ways of this. Either they have large degrees, they have large training fields, but two, they spend time in policy. So they see how policies are implemented, they have the experience of being able to experience this for a very, very large period of time. They have institutional memory that people oftentimes don't have. The second thing is they have procedural expertise, right? So they're trained in methodology, they know what instruments they can use to implement the sort of policy that they want in the most effective manner. And the third thing is we think they're structurally integrated within the government ecosystem in a way that these mini-publics aren't likely to be because they're just not elected in the first place, which means they just know who to call, they have better access to contacts that mean that they'll implement policy more effectively. More on this out of practice.
Thank you, Lolo. DPO.
I'm going to assume I'm audible at this volume. So in my home country, and I'm sure in a lot of home countries, the average ordinary politician and bureaucrat, which for some weird reason is the false comparative that OO pushes on us, is Oxford educated, tends to be old as shit, comes from a family where their parents themselves are also politicians. They tend to engage disproportionately with left-wing media and welfare-related policies, whereas the average ordinary person on the ground is very much not any one of those things. The first thing to note here is that I think the members of the public that would comprise the mini-public are oftentimes individuals who come from all walks of life. They might not have the kinds of technical expertise that they need in order to implement the policies, but it's unimportant because, as I think CG quite fairly points out, this debate is more about how the decision from that mini-public is going to be executed on the ground. Secondly, they might not have a lot of technocratic expertise, but that's fine as well because per the info slide, this is not going to be a decision that requires you to have a lot of technical and numerical literacy, that requires you to know how all these moving parts are going to exist. The problem, therefore, in OO's case is that they are just hugely disingenuous with forcing us to come up with concrete numbers on some policy that you just don't need the concrete numbers for because it's in this house believes that motion, and because more importantly, I'm not a freaking technocrat who is actually trying to execute this policy on the ground. So the first thing to say here is I want to bring some new material about how this increases legitimacy and increases political engagement on the ground. This is important because what Karen tells you is that this is a context in which most individuals are disillusioned with politics for the variety of reasons that I gave you both in my intro and in Terrence's intro. If it is the case that people are disillusioned, they are oftentimes, one, annoyed at the fact that there are these pressing social policies that they want an answer to, but politicians oftentimes choose to dodge it because they find it politically inexpedient to confront moral questions that either way, no matter how they decide, the people are always going to be somewhat pissed at them for making those decisions. The counterfactual in our world is that when it's a mini-public, where this decision is aggregated from each and every individual on the ground, there is no one clear individual that you can scapegoat those decisions for. So you might be unhappy that certain welfare taxes have been higher than you expected, but you cannot blame the kinds of people who are making those decisions because they come from all walks of life and because that's aggregated. The second thing to say here is that if it's people like you and me who are making these decisions in the form of the mini-public, we get increased legitimacy and political engagement in two ways. One, just the individuals who, by statistics and probability alone, will probably end up on a mini-public at some point in time in the future, will necessarily have to force themselves to confront those ethical and moral differences, to talk about their different lived experiences with individuals who are on that mini-public. That is the way in which you foster increased understanding that allows you to confront those social policies and be content with whatever decision you make, regardless of what is the decision you eventually arrive at. Secondly, the fact that there's clear social discourse that is independent of the political system means that these are social policies that are no longer affiliated with one party or the other. This allows individuals who already are disillusioned with politics in the status quo to understand that these are policies that will affect individuals on a day-to-day basis but are not affiliated with any political party. So for instance, even if I tend to lean left, I might find that the right has certain good points on a certain thing, but I don't have to affiliate myself with that party in order to make that decision. This is how you get better social policies that are bipartisan, go beyond the kinds of polarization that Tarrant gives you in his framing. This is important because I think this argument of political engagement just explains why right from the get-go, you get increased political engagement to get good policies that OO and presumably CO are talking about. So if anything, this is a prerequisite for unlocking a better political system and for more individuals to engage in discourse, which I think in and of itself is valuable when it comes to social policies. Before that, closing.
If you're not on one of these juries, you have no reason to engage in politics because your vote doesn't matter at all. On our side, you vote for a politician, meaning you have more of an incentive to listen, think, and talk about the policy. So even if these people look like you and seem like you, you're not voting, so why do you care?
Okay, the first thing to say here is that voting also happens in our world, so presumably to some extent you will engage with politics, so that's not mutually exclusive. That second half of the POI is gone. The delta here in our world is that even if you aren't the person who is engaged in that particular mini-public, the fact that at any point in time you could be on a mini-public, and the fact that you live on a day-to-day basis with the consequences of social policies that are to be decided in the future, in the past, and in the present, necessarily already gives you an incentive to be engaged with it in the first place. But secondly, I want to deal with all this weird setup quabble coming up from, oh, let's just kill it once and for all because it's nonsense. Firstly, there'll be no way for you to opt out of it in the same way that you cannot opt out of jury duty. If you opt out, you lose your citizenship. Secondly, in terms of the monetary trade-off, I think it's fair to say that a lot of bureaucrats and a lot of politicians are dithering. They are doing nothing in status quo. They are taking like public salary without doing like much shit in the first place. If anything, I'm happy to take their salary away and give it away to the individuals who are poor and who are unable to afford being on this mini-public. We compensate them for their time. Secondly, in terms of the technical aspects, that's just not relevant. The legislators will provide the boundaries for the reasonable conditions of these social policies. They'll do the implementation of it. Thirdly, in terms of time, it is unclear to me why timing is so important. Why is it specifically that when it comes to social policies, we need things to be decided ASAP? Social policies are constantly changing. They are constantly going to deal with be things that individuals have to deal with. It is unclear to me why there's an element of agency or urgency to this, to the same extent that there's urgency, for instance, on like healthcare expenditure or like climate change. All of these are going to be policies that have persisted throughout time. I think many individuals are happy for us to have concrete and reasonable discussions, even if it comes at the expense of time. Secondly, why I think the mini-public is likely to be better compared to politicians. And again, I want to point out two things. One, always unresponsive to both the principle and practical argumentation that Tarrant gives you. I think in the like just absence of response to that argument, those arguments that hold in this debate. But secondly, the burden that we have to defend in this world is not where like bureaucrats are the ones making these decisions, because as we tell you, they're oftentimes fraught with values and moral principles. Therefore, it's likely to be the people who are dealing with it are likely to be politicians in the first place. I think there's 5 reasons why politicians tend to be much worse than the average ordinary person. The first thing to say here is that even if a politician genuinely has the best incentives and the best interests of their voters at heart, they can only ever aggregate the lived experiences of those voters. They can only guess that the person that they visited on the street would want X, Y, Z thing, and in any case, I think oftentimes they cannot even try to approximate it given that lived experiences change and the preferences of individuals vary on different policies. Secondly, in terms of the fact that they are already existing in politics, this means that politicians oftentimes have a certain kind of personality, they have a certain kind of educational background, they have come from a certain age and tenure, which already separates them from the average ordinary person. Thirdly, I think they oftentimes have incentives that are very short-termist in nature. They want to benefit their own electoral incentives rather than the average ordinary person on the ground. So the way in which you get long-term policies and social policies that stick and are like enduring in our world is when you have mini-publics that are decided by individuals who know that for the rest of their lives they will live with the consequences of these social policies. Fourthly, I think electoral incentives can only ever try to catch up to what people want. They're always ever playing the catch-up game. They are dynamic in the same way that the average ordinary person can do so in a mini-public. Fifthly, I think oftentimes politicians have very skewed incentives that are diametrically opposed to what the individual on the ground wants. Finally, I want to do some weighing because it's true that people are flawed and it's true that these mini-publics might not always be perfect. The difference here is that one, you're much more likely to achieve a meaningful consensus because it's people themselves speaking with their own voice rather than relying on the voting system and the political system to aggregate their interests as best as they possibly can. Secondly, they're much more likely to be content with policies and to engage with politics in the first place. In terms of both principle and practical argumentation, this is how you get more proximate and better quality of life for individuals on the ground. So proud to stand in OG.
Sorry, can I go to the washroom really quickly? I really have to go to the washroom. Okay. Does anyone know where the washroom is?
Yeah.
Like outside.
Okay.
Since he's making it permissible, I'm gonna run too.
Okay.
There's like 3 steps that way.
He's the one who asked.
Okay, perfect.
to use the stall?
Sorry?
Did I use the stall?
No, use the URL. No.
They cut this from the recording.
Let me zoom in on the guy saying that.
We're humans, we have needs, we gotta sort them out.
Good pee.
It's a beach.
I'll take a POI from both GovBench. I want to start off by bringing up the issue of practical implementation. I think DPM kind of glazes over this, but like really just put in perspective what Adam is saying here. The model of PM is truly absurd. You're going to have for each individual issue, you're going to have a bunch of individual mini publics that are each made up of a handful of people, which then aggregate together and all their views take in expert testimonies and come to some decision. What the fuck is the process of aggregation? Like, how long does it take for all of these mini publics to then discuss their views, come to some compromise, which for the policies that they seem to be talking about, it doesn't seem like there's much compromise. A lot of them tend to be binary decisions, which further emphasizes the gridlock issue that Adam talks about. How do they aggregate their views? How do they all aggregate expert testimonies? And because they use the word aggregate, but notice to do this in a meaningful way requires all of these people to then come together and talk to each other individually, have long meetings in which they discuss the views, the things that they've learned, hear each other out, analyze those ideas. This is just an incredibly long and enormous process if you want to get anything close to the model that they propose. The second thing is on the sheer scale of the number of people you would have to pay, presumably full time. You have, for each policy, a bunch of mini publics, which then each only focus on this issue. You'd have to pay so many people to just be effectively bureaucrats. And also they have full-time jobs. So you can't just take them and force them to do this and then pay substantially less than what they would otherwise make. I think that's kind of fucked up for the state to compel that. I think in this case you'd have to pay them reasonable to what they earn, or at least a reasonable wage within that country, which is also just incredibly expensive. You could probably spend that money, instead of deciding on how to help marginalized people, you could just actually help the marginalized people with the amount of money that you're spending on stupid, random, ordinary people making decisions, sitting in rooms, talking to each other for years on end, unclear as to how they're ever really able to come to a consensus. So I think the actual implementation of their model is absurd. I think the better version of that, I'll take a POI in a second, is just that you have maybe one or a handful of mini publics for each individual decision, that you don't have this large aggregation process, that they function relatively more like juries as opposed to a huge collection of juries then come together on each individual policy. Sure, OG.
Every day, in every country, thousands upon thousands of jury trials take place, often on weeks-long issues. They are compensated. The court system is a fraction of a country's GDP. The world moves on.
But this is, okay, I don't know. First of all, with juries, this doesn't take all of your time. This isn't a full-time job. It's you have one court trial once every several weeks, maybe every several months. So this is clearly not the same. If you wanted to talk about, especially since one of your arguments is being able to devote full time on this particular policy, this is not comparable to juries in the slightest. Sure, CG. Okay, cool. Anyways, moving on. Firstly, I want to talk about optics and flip the argument that we get from Gov. Right? They claim that this is going to be viewed top-down, and that's ops change is top-down, that's bad. Why this isn't viewed as top-down? It's because people actively participate in the government through elections, through supporting groups, interest groups, through participating in political demonstrations, through other forms of activism like signing petitions or calling your local municipal leader. Even if these aren't super significant in changing the outcomes of the kinds of policies you are able to actively participate in that discussion. And just being able to take your body there and feel like maybe you have some kind of influence, that you're surrounded by people who are rallying for the same thing, or they're able to participate, that is something that is really important for the optics and people, the way people feel about being represented in that democracy. No, thank you. But the second thing is, even if change is viewed as top-down on government, on our side of the house, at least it's the majority of people within that country felt like they got a say in that, right? Even though it's top-down from the government, at least the majority of people felt like they elected that government, right? On government, on Gov side, people feel that they have literally no actual say over important social policies that they have because they don't have any real influence over mini publics. Philosophically, maybe mini publics are more representative of the people, but it doesn't actually mean that people feel like it's represented. They have literally no part in the selection process. Mini publics are faceless and nameless. They have no idea who the people are who are making these decisions. And people don't know bureaucrats, but at least they know the elected party whom they can largely point to who is responsible for the bureaucrats and either praise them or blame them. And on scapegoating, right? I actually think that scapegoating is a good thing. It's a really important function of the elected party for people to vent their frustrations on, even if it's not always their fault, right? Like, at least you have some kind of outlet, a target for your frustration. On their side, it's even worse than getting mad at the elected party. You feel entirely alienated from the policy-making process. People literally feel despondent or resentful of the entire structure of democracy in the government, not just the elected party, right? And that means that people's general faith in the government decreases, and democracy and activism decreases, right? So you have increased vulnerability to demagogues taking over, and a higher risk of social breakdown, and just generally people feel way more frustrated because they have absolutely no agency in a way that I think is unique on their side. Sure, Suchi.
It's quite different to have to sit across a table from an LGBT person and explain why they shouldn't have rights rather than to imagine them as some other part of the political side in media discourse.
Okay, I didn't understand that. Cool, moving on. Cool. Secondly, I want to talk about who these bureaucrats are versus who the mini publics are. Right? Mini publics. Firstly, on bureaucrats, they say that they're ivory tower pieces of shit. I actually don't think this is true. Why? Because a lot of these bureaucratic positions just aren't super lucrative jobs. Like a lot of the bureaucrats on like climate policy or policy on marginalized groups, they do it because they really care, right? It's like very difficult work. It's very long, often like you don't make a lot of progress. So the people who go into that often spent their education learning about that, have a very intrinsic vested interest in doing a good job, right? Like especially, I think on their side, also in academics, I think there's just a dominance of left-wing views in academia that often biases towards marginalized groups. So I think even though ivory tower people often be very privileged, they also have a bias towards trying to help people who are less privileged. On mini publics, you can fully just have a mini public of people who are just fucking terrible, right? Like just awful people. That is a very real possibility on their side of the house. But get a handful of people that are just mostly terrible, right? But the second thing is I think they're far more susceptible to corruption because A, these people don't have any accountability metrics for making sure. Secondly, they say themselves that they can't opt out, so they don't really have a risk of losing these positions. But I also just think in general they're far more susceptible to corruption because they don't have any other governmental checks, or people don't know at all where they are. They don't have any connections to the party. So I think that's on that. Thirdly, on decision making, right? I think on time, that mini publics are actually far more likely to be strapped for time and attention. Even if you're paid full time to be on a mini public, legislature is not their primary interest for a career. You can't just take a finance bro who spent the last 5 years of his life grinding the stock market, put him in a mini public on LGBTQ+ issues, and expect him to spend the next 5 years on that, right? Like they're going to spend the rest of their time looking at the stock market or like trying to advance their career in other ways, right? Conversely, bureaucrats are paid full time, even if they're forced to juggle decisions between multiple policies, at least that is all within the realm of policymaking, not between completely separate and divergent interests. Lastly, on the effect of technical knowledge, right? They say that implementation is not within the realm of debate. Perhaps so, but I think what Adam tells you is that technical knowledge is still really important in the decision-making process. That even if you don't require it to make a decision, you should know because it affects like what the later impacts or like the impacts between other seemingly unrelated topics or areas of impact are. I think overall we make better decisions. I think we don't have gridlock. I think this is a realistic version of how government should operate.
Is this a good volume? Okay. I prefer non-verbal POI, so just raise your hand. OO falls out of this debate for 3 reasons. A, we have fiat, fee. OG's model was incredibly reasonable and says things like we'll have multiple people to fiat out randomness, we'll have things like bureaucrats, which OO says are good to guide this process. We think all of these technical picks fall out of this debate. Lastly, states are multi-billion-dollar industries. They have no fiat on their side to say that, oh, if they save money, it's not just going to be spent on a tax break for billionaires. They have no impact. We think that OO is irrelevant at this point in the round. A few things then. What is the comparative in this debate? And 2, why do we improve the political climate as a whole and policy as a whole for everybody? But also, lastly, how we're going to fill in the link from opening government on how reasoned discussion actually occurs in these panels and why they end up making social policies that are more moderate and incremental and why that's a good thing. Firstly, what is the comparative in this debate? Because OD doesn't really point out these systemic reasons why governments are bad at making structural policies. They just say that bureaucrats are old and out of touch and unable to make good decisions. A few things. 1, there is massive influence of corporate lobbying groups over the vast majority of democracies. Think of, for example, the life insurance industry or the healthcare industry and how much incentives they have when it comes to things like medically assisted diets. 2, special interest groups have disproportionate power because you as the average person likely is not affected by a social issue like MAID or gay rights if you're not part of that group. Groups that really care, like evangelicals or those who are specifically activated, are likely to use disproportionate amounts of their time and energy, so politicians are likely to internalize poorly how popular of a view a social opinion actually is. The third thing, and the thing that the other side is to reckon with, is that voter turnout is low in many democracies, and there are structural difficulties in being able to vote. Things like gerrymandering, things like erosion of freedom of speech, that means that democracies are not perfectly symmetric, or even mostly symmetric of people's opinions on social issues. But the fourth thing that I want to note here is that elections are about a variety of issues. They are about economic issues, they are about security issues, they are about social issues. Just because a majority party has a mandate to govern does not mean you have a moral objective or a moral power from the people to decide on these slippery questions that we have. Think of, for example, the mandate that George Bush was given after 9/11 to deal with security issues. That did not necessarily mean he represented the social interests or the best social decisions of the American public. But lastly, and we want to say that this happens in a vast majority of instances, is that politicians hijack social issues in the political climate to make them an overwhelming part of political discourse. Why is this? One, we think that social issues elicit extremely strong emotions. They're often linked to base ideas like love, life, death, health, and religion that people feel incredibly strongly about and are likely to trigger an emotion that gets them interested and involved in your political platform. The second thing is they're often easier and more intuitive to understand than technical policy around things like carbon taxes or trade policy that is very hard for the average person to picture what the illustration is versus the other side wants the state to euthanize your grandma in the hospital. So we think that politicians often use these because they're an emotional shortcut to be able to activate voters. But lastly, we think there are often built-in coalitions like religious groups, again, that you can exploit based on social issues, which is why that social issues come to dominate politics. Think of, for example, Don't Say Gay and how that got Ron DeSantis elected in Florida, or think about the war on drugs and how that capitalized on people's feeling about social issues and drug consumption, rather than focusing on any of the broader economic or important issues at the time. I'll take the clarification, the information.
You could still pay money to someone on one of these juries to do as you please. It's just that because they need to win an election afterward, they can get away with it without any real penalty. So
Okay,
how's lobbying better on your side?
Let's move on to my comparative then. Why do we think we get better? First, why do we think reasoned deliberation is possible? Note how OG doesn't actually recognize this in their speech. There are two things. Relative to opposition, it is much, much harder to lobby an entire country of people to wager that everyone in that community is going to be on your side. It's impossible to even say how a life insurance company would want to lobby an entire country to make sure that MAID policies in their favor are passed. It's just incredibly unrealistic. But B, we think that the average person has empathy, and that is the most incredibly important link that we think opening government doesn't actually point out. That the political system right now is highly abstract, that when you are often played in a political climate that encourages you to think of as good guys and bad guys, that means that it's very hard to see the other team as an actual person that is going to be affected by a specific policy. We think that when people are forced to sit down at a table and they're forced to reckon with the fact that A, in the mini public, most people are going to be neutral or slightly positive or slightly negative with a few extremists, we think you're far more likely to come to a consensus decision that is going to err towards the middle. We think this has two significant impacts. One, we think that A, changes are likely to be moderate and they're likely to be incremental. We think there are a lot of incremental things you have to consider when you're implementing policies like MAID. So for example, like Alzheimer's and whether that should be included in MAID, how long the waiting period should be, whether there should be a mandatory waiting period. We think that things like this, when you have radical changes spurred by special interest groups, like for example in Canada, how MAID numbers have been rapidly increasing over the last few years at an unprecedented pace. We think that often results in policies that people are unsatisfied with and are captured by specific groups. But B, we think that particular link, again, of empathy and the fact that you actually have to engage with the person on the other side of the table and tell them that no, we don't think that you deserve rights and we think that you deserve to suffer, often makes it much more difficult for people to emotionally make that decision. So we think that people are likely to come to much more empathetic, generous decisions. Yes?
I'm pretty sure that someone who's forced into a mini public against their will is far less likely to feel accountable to that job and doing a good job than a bureaucrat who spent their entire life working towards making policy.
Okay, if all of your analysis is true, then everyone in a jury is horrible and they never make good decisions. I just don't understand why this matters to this debate. What are the implications of this on politics for everybody? There are two implications, and I want to point out why this is so important. Because opening government only focuses on the execution of social issues. But at their core, social issues are about moral questions that affect small groups of people. So if you aren't impacted by MAID, or if you're not impacted by gay marriage, it doesn't actually influence your lives very much. Rather, we think that broader policy issues like on the economy actually tangibly affect people's day-to-day lives, their income, their ability to support themselves, their ability to live a good and happy life. Why do we think that this makes the political climate worse? For all the reasons that I gave you earlier, politicians often justify their policies and use their social issues to paper over their poor economic policies. Again, see Florida and the fact that Ron DeSantis has not been able to promote Florida business or Florida economies. I think this takes up overwhelming amounts of time on the airspace because of the fact that it's simple, because of the fact that it activates people and it gets them to the ballot box. We are not saying that on our side of the house, contentious policies don't exist and contentious politics don't exist. But note how huge amounts of airtime, huge amounts of politician platforms are currently being devoted to social issues, and all of that space has to be filled. And when that space has to be filled, they have to be accountable. They have to actually demonstrate to the public how they're able to advance economic issues, how they're actually able to implement trade issues, and they have to work to make those illustrations and make those policies actually clear and relevant for the average voters in ways that they're just not trying to in the status quo. We think this is incredibly important because we think when those issues are mainstream, you are far more likely to people who have actual good understanding of trade policy, understand why free trade is important, and make that a priority which affects hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people's very livelihoods and ability to support themselves. We think the effect of the political climate cannot be understated in this debate. The last thing that I want to note is that to note how this changes activism. Activism is no longer about harassing one single politician as much as possible or being as combative and loud as possibly heard. It's about trying to have more discourse online, trying to reach as many people and make a nuanced opinion so that you can hope to make a small shift in these mini publics. For all these reasons, I'm very proud to propose.
When you tell the population of a democratic state that all of this stuff you guys don't need to think about anymore, it's just been handled, not everyone is going to agree with you. And that will undermine the legitimacy of the state in some really fundamental ways. But even worse, some people will agree with you. And that's why we are going to be the first team in this debate to call out this policy for what it is. It is a massive shrinking of democracy. It is dictatorship by sample size. Because even if the population at large wants something, they can't decide that thing because these assemblies have already made that decision for them. Two extensions. First, how this poisons and destroys political discourse, and secondly, how you get more extremism and less representative policies. Before that, some brief rebuttal. First thing we hear, lobbying is going to be more difficult. False. You yourself appear to assume that these people will be in these positions for extended periods of time, taking advice from all kinds of experts. They might be there for months on end. Being there for months on end is plenty of time for a corporate lobbyist to pay you a wad of cash to do as they please. The response was, but there's lots of people. Yes, the average person is also bribable with a lot less money. So it does rather cancel out. And the worst thing is they have no accountability. So even if this is illegal and it comes to light after, there is no meaningful harm to them. Secondly, they say the problem is that not all political mandates are all extensive. We agree. Have a referendum where the sample size is the whole of society. If you believe that merely one party winning one election does not give them power to decide all issues, there are other ways we can solve it. Thirdly, they said, well, we hijack issues because politicians beat up on minorities in a bid to get power, so political discourse on social issues is incredibly toxic. A couple of problems with this. First, we don't think it's bad that lobby groups for social policies exist and are very loud and vocal. They have incredibly strong feelings about these issues, and a problem in typical democracy is that we can't capture the intensity of people's feelings on issues. Lobbying groups tend to solve that. If your concern is that the silent majority, it gets left out, I'd like to point out in ordinary democratic elections they have a huge amount of power. That is why the Republicans are on the retreat on abortion policy, because it turns out the vast majority of Americans actually believe access to abortion is important. They say, but sitting opposite a gay person changes your view on who they are and makes you more empathetic. Many responses to this. Number one, there also exist gay legislators you have to meet in the hall and negotiate with. The same effect, if you believe in contact theory, applies there. Two, if you are genuinely a Christian and you believe that approving this policy means you burn in hell forever, the contact is not going to make a difference. Many Christian fundamentalists are lovely in person. You should talk to them sometime. The fact that they are nice to you in person has no bearing on how they actually act. Thirdly, the comparative is actually worse. you are situating this gay person and this conservative person in a context which is explicitly confrontational, where they are told they represent opposing points on the political spectrum, right? The much better way for people to learn and be empathetic is to meet people when you go to school or have a gay neighbor, and that's the kind of change which actually happens. Last, these people are often just angry and frustrated. They've been there against their will. They've been dragged there. The response has been, but what about jury duty? Juries often make awful decisions and let people off and can't come to consensuses because they don't pay attention and are worried about their jobs. They say, we'll pay these people lots of money. You can pay them money. You're disrupting their daily schedule to be absent from work for lots of months. They'll be de-skilled, but they're not in the workplace. People might not like them very much when they come back. They might have to make alternative plans for their kids. Putting a bunch of angry, frustrated, largely apathetic people into a room to make them decide the fate of gay people is just a bit risky, guys. I don't think you're going to make things better. So, extension. What are the impacts on political discourse? Why does it get a lot worse? The first thing is I want to point out, lots of people will just tune out. In fact, closing girls extension requires people to tune out en masse in society, right? Why is it people tune out? Engaging in political discourse is emotionally exhausting. It takes a lot of time, right? When you now tell people you don't have any power, the reaction is, for a large number of them, why do I do any of this at all? The problem then is that you ossify social ideas about social policies at a particular point in time because there's no, I'll take a moment, much less social discourse about these kinds of issues, right? There's much less reason for people to listen to politicians making arguments or to make arguments to each other when they don't think they'll be making these decisions in the first place. Yeah.
If you are an activist group that cares about a cause like legalizing gay marriage, your form of activism changes. You care now more about educating, things like PSAs, things like representation. That doesn't mean you tune out at all. It just means you change how your efforts are in a more peaceful way.
You already do that in the status quo, and people listen to you because they think, well, I might be able to vote on this. I have power to decide who gets married or not when I go to the ballot box. Now, if you try to educate people, they can say, like, sure, that's great, like, not my problem. I have no power over these issues. So advocacy does become significantly more difficult. But secondly, what happens is that to the extent we do get discourse, it then becomes often about technical policy, because that is what it's left to people to still have a debate about. But the problem is that when overall democratic debate becomes about tax policy, trade policy, borrowing, interest rates, these are the issues people are least qualified to determine well. Often they involve very delicate, long, short-term trade-offs. I'll take you in a moment. Not quite now, but maybe next time. Yeah? Often things like trade policy become caught up by tribal ideas like we shouldn't buy from China because that's just bad, which is like a pretty bad response because your tribalism prevents you from thinking about how higher product costs might affect the worst of people in society. So you concentrate all the remaining discourse in areas where people tend to make bad decisions. Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, we told you way back in opening that politicians actually often have an incentive to step back from social issues. So the democratic status quo you're defending is the one in which all the core social issues, same-sex marriage, abortion access, have all been determined by unelected judges.
Is this debate only happening in America? I don't know. Like, some issues are decided by the Supreme Court in the United States of America, a highly pathological democratic society and non-representative in many respects. In most other countries, it's just not like that, okay? So, bad discussion. Thirdly, what happens is that we might then default to things like personality, cult of personality. I'm voting for this guy because he's no power, because he looks like me, or he sounds like me, or he says he will, defend traditional values. Or we just get overall non-legitimacy. And in fairness, closing, do raise this, I want to tell you what it actually looks like, right? What it looks like is when people say the laws passed by these groups are not real laws and they don't represent me, especially when every political party which does not agree with these groups has an incentive to paint them as illegitimate, right? That's when we get conspiracy theorizing. And if that happens in the status quo, but no, the incentive and ability to make this happen is so much worse. Why is this important? Compliance with laws requires people to have faith in the government. For people to pay taxes, to be willing to send their kids to public school, to be kind to a gay neighbor, right? To bring out the recycling, because we can't force people to do it all the time, requires you to believe that these people really represent you in some way. And when you didn't choose who they are, when it was a mathematical sampling method a statistician devised for you, you do not have faith in that. So what's therefore the dichotomy in this debate? You get a large group of people who entirely cede the democratic decision-making power. And you have another large group of people who default to modes of discourse which make society concretely worse. We stand for democracy. Opposed.
On both sides, people are going to find themselves on the wrong end of decisions made about social policy. In our world, they'll find themselves on the wrong end of mini-publics, and in their world, they'll find themselves on the wrong end of a government that they didn't vote for, that they believe is illegitimate, and that they've internalized a ton of political narratives about how evil they are and how much they want to tear down democracy. I think the margin on that claim that closing up has to show you is why it's comparatively easier to demonize mini-publics. And yes, you can make the argument that they are less representative, but equally, losing an election, believing that the deep state lost an election for you, or the struggle that people have to demonize their fellow citizens that actually make these things up, as opposed to politicians who seem look more like caricatures to them alongside their supporters, is a very significant difference. And maybe we don't win on this question in the debate, but we don't have to. We have to prove that there's an ability to deflect blame. It is CO's offensive burden to show that the level of trust of democracy decreases, and I think that is probably broadly similar on both sides. It just affects different groups of people, and the blame gets externalized in different ways. I'm going to do three things. First, I'm going to talk about why our extension wins the round, especially over opening government. Then I'm going to take out CO, and then I'm going to weigh over opening opposition. First, what does our extension do? The first thing I want to do is reconcile our characterization with the one that opening government mentions in their POI. We agree with opening government that there are sets of cases where there are incentives to retreat from social policy and not talk about it in politics in some cases, to delay change, not implement reforms, whereas citizens would. However, culture wars obviously exist in a significant number of high-impact cases in the debate. The lower margin cases are probably the ones where it comes out of politics and doesn't matter as much, because often legislative change, judicial change will happen in those cases. But obviously culture wars happen to a significant degree over these issues. And we agree with closing opposition that the quality of discourse over like salt cap relief is not good discourse, but that is not what we are arguing. We are not arguing that in the absence of being able to talk about social issues, that people start talking about the details of tax policy and trade policy at a policy level. We are arguing that people will hold governments to account that are failing on economic issues because they are less able to paper over those failures with promises to put into place don't say gay laws, to ban abortion, and a whole set of other cases. And in some cases these will fail, and in some cases the Republicans won't win out. But the point is that governments often are able to distract from poor economic policy making by importing social policy into political discourse, often in extremely toxic ways. The link that we fill next to opening government is why this changes in our world. Opening government suggests that people might reach reasonable conclusions here which move social change faster. There are two burdens which are missing. First, why does the discussion happen in good ways? Why are people receptive and why do they listen? And I think closing opposition points out that gap relative to opening government. And second, what types of policies do they end up with? We argue that when a politician wins an election, they are heavily incentivized to introduce a comparatively radical and much more zero-sum version of change. You know that the other party can come into power and roll back that change. Your base wants the most radical version of the policy because they've elected you on that basis. And as a consequence, you probably don't initially introduce policy in a moderate way. We saw that in Canada with MAID, when the Liberals felt that they had a mandate to introduce MAID in an extremely aggressive way, which has led the amount of deaths happening by MAID in Canada to rise by 300% year on year relative to 2021. Our argument, as not engaged with closing opposition, was that more moderate versions of policy change, which are more likely to attract support and less likely to be demonized, are more likely to happen. And we agree that there'll be cases where there's confrontation, as there would be in any jury or judge deliberation. But our argument is this. You know you're sitting next to this person for a couple of weeks or a month. You don't immediately begin with aggression and with anger because you have to face that person, you have to talk to them. But also they're a person just like you. I'm not talking about Christian fundamentalists changing their mind on LGBT issues. I'm talking about a normal person wondering about whether they should allow children to transition at a younger age. I'm talking about moderate policies that people disagree on and are far more likely to hear each other out as compared to political discourse, where it's very hard to make first-person arguments that actually appeal to individual people, where arguments are more likely to form caricatures about the other side rather than a real person standing across from you. Closing.
Politicians are much less likely to pass extreme policies because they'll be punished in the ballot box at the next election. These juries do not face those accountability measures.
Yes, but for the reasons you've observed, there's a lot of ideological disagreement within them, which means that it's hard to find a consensus that's extremely radical. Yes, politicians don't want to lose elections, but they are vulnerable to their base. The DUP at Northern Ireland is always going to have to pass socially conservative policy and fulfill that role in its coalition because its base cares about this. I agree that there are disincentives to do crazy things, and yet they still happen for ideological reasons. And also it's a comparative debate, and their argument directly relies on the idea, in fact, their extension relies on the idea that we are not achieving social change and ideas ossify. So that POI would seem to be in tension with the outcome they think is actually going to happen. Why will social change not ossify? There are a couple of reasons. First, the discourse about these issues is removed from politics, but critically, it is not removed from the public sphere. Politicians are less incentivized to talk about gay marriage or abortion and so on, because the consequence of saying something controversial on this is no longer trading off by the fact that you can win an election using this issue. And as a consequence, it's more likely that activist groups, lawyers, civil society activists still talk about these issues on social media, in news, etc. We still hear about these issues, and also people know that they have a neighbor who served on one of these things. They see these issues happening around them. You don't just forget about these issues. The reason why they're activated in politics is that they're very salient and important to people. Before I go on, open.
So your comparative is that people will now hold governments more accountable on complex economic policy that they struggle to understand in the status quo. I think the far more likely counterfactual is more attention on mudslinging cults of personality, which are already used.
So potentially in some cases that happens. Our argument, again, is not that the most technical forms of accountability happen, but rather that when the economy is doing poorly and governments might otherwise be able to save themselves by appealing to social issues, or where voters are presented with a broad and narrow choice, where they can't achieve their democratic value of outcome because they have to choose between voting on the economic issues that they want to vote on, or voting for the party that represents them on social issues. And that's what brings us into engaging with the quasi-principled argument of closing off, which is a lot of rhetoric about a principle, but not a proved principle about why this is actually unrepresentative. The first thing I want to point out is that existing democracy is extremely unrepresentative. You are bound by the majority anyway. You lose, the other side still dominates you. Yes, there are institutions, but relative to social policy, they can pass these through. Your vote is insignificant in the massive tide of other votes that pushes things through. And moreover, there is significant corruption. Now, I agree, you technically could bribe someone onto one of these juries, but here's the thing. Lobbying a company is legal. You just have to register. Bribing a member of one of these things is very illegal, and companies that actually do it will get in trouble for doing it, and they will go to jail or face steep fines. So the point that Rena was making in all the stuff she added to opening government about political discourse was that political discourse is in fact ossified, as closing off says, by the power of corporate interest groups and by the power of tons of forces that mean that we don't get progress fast enough. So what's the endpoint for our case? 1, we prove that deliberation can actually happen successfully, not in all cases, but in a meaningful set of cases. We prove that the realm of politics is not technical economic policy, but just holding governments to account for basic economic failures or incompetency or corruption or any other issue, it doesn't have to be economic, on which they are doing a poor job. And we fill in the links about how discourse improves in our world. For that reason, very proud to win this debate. Are we good?
Two questions. First, does electoral democracy work? Second, are many publics preferable? Before that, one point of extraneous rebuttal to closing government. On the claim that social change happens in a much more radical way because you have to cater to your base. 3 problems with this claim. First, you have disproportionate incentives in democracies to win over swing voters. This is because swing voters are the voters who are most powerful. Your base has no option except to vote for you because they are terrified of the other side winning. As a consequence, in the US, you focus on Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. Here's the thing about swing voters. They are more likely to be moderate because they are indecisive between the 2 different political parties. So our side overpowers moderate voters, even if moderate voters are not the majority of the population. But second, you have incentives to engage in horse trading. Risk aversion in politics means you often put in place institutions that make it hard to pass extreme versions of social change, like the filibuster in the US, because you're terrified the other side will get in power and do this extreme thing. That means you have to engage in horse trading within the political system that inherently moderates the political process. Third, I don't understand why you are as vulnerable to your base as CG claims. They just say the word base. Your base is unlikely to leave you. They say this knifes our claim on social change. No, our claim was not that social change is radical. Our claim is that social change happens and you are less likely to have discourse about social change on their side. This argument is out the window. No, thank you. First, on whether electoral democracy works. First, I just want to highlight that electoral democracy is the likely alternative. Opening government's claim that it's the courts is fairly unlikely, because as a politician who wants to get elected, you want to have as much power and influence as possible. That is why you are a politician. This means legislatures have strong incentives to disempower courts and appoint judges who are likely to listen to their interests. See FDR backing the Supreme Court with judges who are like him. So the alternative is unrealistic. The alternative, of course, is unrealistic. The alternative of bureaucrats from opening opposition is similarly unrealistic, because as proposition points out, technical elements of this policy will still be implemented by bureaucrats. It's just the decision-making process that is changing. So the realistic alternative is legislators who are elected through the democratic process. What are their arguments for why this democratic process fails? First argument, corporate lobbying groups. Corporate lobbying is overwhelmingly exaggerated. Frankly, I hate how debaters can get away with saying corporate lobbying and then not make the argument for why it changes policy. In fact, there's a large body of work showing that lobbying does not actually change policy in democracies that much. And there are good reasons why. No closing government says the word lobbying. They have no reasons. So I give you reasons that beats their claim on itself. One, because corporations are ultimately donating to give politicians the capacity to advertise themselves to the public. If they advertise themselves to the public, but then take money to a corporation to do something the public doesn't want to do, that beats the point of advertising to the public, which is why the scope of change corporations can push on politicians is limited. Second, most countries have substantial restrictions on lobbying and caps on campaign finance. Pretty clear game theoretic incentive, which is lobbying groups will keep donating to the other side of the political aisle, and you'll keep having to deviate from the public but gain no relative advantage because the corporation is sponsoring the other party as well, which means you are lucky to pass policies that limit the extent of lobbying. And third, corporations often try to get the politicians they already want in power rather than trying to change the minds of politicians, which reduces the scope of influence. They say you will go to jail if you engage in corrupt lobbying, but no juror will report you if they can just get money on the side, so I don't think this argument against Ashish's response works either. Their second claim is some people don't turn out to vote, these people are entirely excluded. First, people who don't turn out to vote in democracies are still quite represented. Why? Because if you want gains in a political system, you have to appeal to people who are currently not turning out to make them turn out. Some of these people won't turn out anyway, but making that appeal means people who don't turn out are often represented in close democratic elections. But second, most democracies globally, especially in poorer countries, have pretty high turnout. Like India has 70 to 80% turnout and a polling booth every 2 kilometers. Why? Because there's often churn in your political base. People die out, they grow old, they stop voting. You won't have the chance to appeal to new voters in close elections, creating strong incentives to try to make voting accessible and turnout high. Third, there's a claim from opening government that those who are most affected by the decision are represented on their side. We're just going to take a stance. Democracy is better for this, and special interest groups are good. Why? Because people who care more about a political issue are more likely to be single-issue voters, or voters who disproportionately are likely to switch their vote on the basis of how this issue is decided. That means democracy, unlike many republics, are great at accounting for preference intensity. That is, if there is an evangelical group that really opposes abortion and cares nothing much about anything else, they are overrepresented in democracy. That's great. The evangelical group cares more about preventing abortions, therefore they should be represented in democracy. You know who else is represented? Women who think there is a risk of them getting access to abortions. This also beats that claim on empathy when there's a queer person sitting across you from the table. I'm sorry, 1 in 12 is probably larger than the percentage of queer people in the average developing country who are openly queer. However, queer people are more likely to vote on queer issues, meaning democracy, if anything, represents them more, killing their claim on queerness. Finally, there's a claim that you only ever aggregate lived experiences, but the politicians obviously have a strong incentive to learn what the public wants, like run town halls and so on to gain a competitive advantage in politics. So I don't think this claim from opening government works either. I want to talk about whether mini republics are preferable before that opening.
Yeah, so you're never going to have a perfect democracy where politicians are so well informed about people's lived experiences, take into account all political discourse, and are held accountable for all bad decisions. If there's no real correct answer to most social policies, why should we outsource to an inherently flawed politician?
Because your mini republics are significantly more flawed, as I'm going to explain in a moment. No thanks. First, I want to talk about policies that are not social policies. They say economic policies are not discussed on our side, social issues are more discussed. We get discussion on economic policies. It's just worth noting that economic policy is still an important voting issue on the basis of people's lived experience on our side. So if they lose a job, they often blame their politician for it. There is retrospective voting on the basis of whether the politician's policies led to their lives getting better or worse. This is a better form of voting than trying to get informed about the economy and making ideological discussions based on political discussions of the economy. Because you cannot hold a politician accountable on economic policy when the discussion is of this nature. First, if the discussion is technical, people are more rather than less likely to disengage from politics. But second, you often can't follow a technical discussion, so politicians have incentives to mislead you, blame the previous candidate for what happened on the economy, try to rile up ideological grounds like the idea that free trade is what cost America its jobs that Trump ran on. You're more likely to get tons more of this discourse when electoral discourse shifts to an issue that voters struggle to easily understand and therefore can be more misled on. But politicians can't paper over their failures on economic policy because economics is people's everyday lives. Like if I lost a job, no politician can distract me with a social issue in front of my face, so they make economic discussion and economic policy much worse. But they also impact political engagement. Why? Because you are probably not going to be in a mini public. Sure, you're unlikely to be the pivotal voter, but the act of voting makes you feel like you have an influence, which is what drives you to engage in politics. On their side, they don't engage because they are not part of the mini public.